In the beginning, there was resolve, and from the resolve emerged a unique spirit. Reeling from economic decline, Evansville city leaders resolved to bring public higher education here, and they managed to translate their resolve into a resolution passed in the 1965 legislature directing Indiana University and Purdue University to establish a 4-year course of study in Evansville. However, neither school was willing to do so. But Mayor Frank McDonald Sr. resolved to bring an end to the impasse, quietly convincing Indiana State University officials to begin classes in Evansville and getting the Meade Johnson Company to allow the unused Centennial School, then nearly 90 years old, to temporarily house the Evansville Extension. On September 15, 1965, 412 students made history by enrolling in the first classes. The classes were held mostly in the evenings because the adjunct faculty had other daytime jobs. For 4 years, students and the faculty who were to guide their study overcame the challenges of their dilapidated classrooms. More resolve. In the meantime, to ensure that this new college had a proper home, community leaders rolled up their sleeves and convinced area residents to open their checkbooks. Southern Indiana Higher Education Incorporated was formed as a nonprofit entity, and by using a community chest model for fundraising that included payroll deductions at major employers, they raised nearly $1 million in less than a year to purchase a 1,400-acre tract of land that they called Mid-America University Center. Enter the legislators. Pressing for funding from the state to build the first building, the Science Center and Administration Building. Ground was broken for the campus in 1968, and classes were held the next year. Never mind that there were no sidewalks or parking lots at first. It was still better than Centennial. State appropriations for buildings continued at a steady pace, with the library opening in 1971, the University Center in 1973, and the Technology Center in 1975. It would be 5 more years before the Physical Activities Center opened, the first facility of its type to be allowed on any regional campus. It seemed this new campus was always breaking new ground and clearing extra hurdles. Each struggle only added to the resolve and rekindled the unique spirit. With every new building came community help to cover the gap between state funding and actual needs. Student Government Association leaders led a Books for the Library drive to help build the first collection. Individuals and businesses furnished the rooms of the University Center. A radio station was donated to create an on-the-air broadcasting studio in the Technology Center. And a $300,000 fund drive added spectator seating to the Physical Activity Center. With its first graduating class in 1971, confidence began to build that the institution could chart its own course. By the mid-70s, community leaders had advanced the idea of independence to the new Indiana Commission for Higher Education, and legislators began planning for that eventuality. Bills were introduced but did not pass. Undaunted, legislators and community leaders kept the issue alive. To continue meeting the needs of the region, the university needed better funding to expand undergraduate programs and to add master's degrees. But it appeared that full development of public higher education opportunities would happen only when the university had its own trustees. With the first gasoline crisis in the early 80s, students needed affordable housing close to campus. Southern Indiana Higher Education stepped in to develop apartments on its property. But at first, they were refused by Indiana State University trustees, who said housing was prohibited on branch campuses. ISU ultimately yielded to pressure from the Southern Indiana community, but not before the housing issue had breathed new life into the drive for separation from ISU. In 1983, the Indiana Commission for Higher Education issued a report that paved the way for a freestanding institution. Evansville native Robert D. Orr was in his second term as governor, and he assured everyone that he would guide the process to separate ISUE from Indiana State. No one expected it to be easy, especially the legislative delegation whose leadership on the issue had been thwarted in the past.
But it was a great undertaking, and there was pulling together from all sides. I mean, if you look at all of the community support from around not only Vanderburgh County, but throughout southwestern and southern Indiana, of government leaders, legislators, it happened. And I can truthfully say that given the years that I served, this probably is the single most important event during my tenure that I can point to suggest that we really succeeded in achieving a great goal for this part of the state, and now the whole state, with the some 10,000 students that are here.
The bill in '84, which established the Board of Incorporators, and that year was the year that I think Greg and Jeff and I don't know who else, we had a lot of community leaders when what is now American General lent us a plane, and Black Beauty Coal lent us a plane, and we flew all over the state to the leaders in Muncie and Indianapolis and Fort Wayne to get leadership on board prior to the session. And that was very important. And Tom Tooley and Bill Jackson came with us, and they wanted, and I think just the fact that they were there put pressure on leaders. It was beginning to be, how can you continue to say no when this is so important to the educational opportunities of young people in southern Indiana? And I think that message finally got out there.
The critical time that really set the ball rolling was when George Weathersby, who was chairman of the Education Commission, came down and said, we're going to do a study, we've done a study, we're going to release the findings, and those findings, and this was a clandestine meeting, nobody particularly knew about it. I think Jeff and myself, we were called, we met at the Days Inn on 41,
Right.
and I remember we're looking out over the parking lot. It was he and his staff person, and he said, now I'm going to be leaving the commission, but we've done this study, and I wanted to give you a heads up. The study shows that that the post-secondary attainment of Indiana is below all other states, with the exception of Arkansas and West Virginia, and southwestern Indiana is even below those. And this study is going to be released. And he says, I want to give you a heads up. At that point we thought, well, that's great, because we've never had a recommendation from the commission before, or at least a report showing that we needed accessibility and affordability of education.
But when we were invited to that clandestine meeting you're talking about at that motel, just the three of us, I thought we were going to hear bad news. Because why are these doing this? I thought it was going to be bad news, and all of a sudden, he had just been to a meeting of community people, and he asked somebody, he said, what do these people want? They want independence. And so then they came to us, and I don't know exactly what the gist of the meeting was, but he kind of laid out a plan. And they were for it. Like you said, he had quoted polls that showed we were undereducated down here and everything. We needed this. But anyway, that's when I knew that the tide was turning, after about 10 or 15 years of every year, you know.
And we went into a back meeting room of Don Cox's office, and the governor sat at that table, and all the legislators, both parties there. And he said, he's going to do this, and you're going to have a university down there. He said, I want to tell you, I don't want any criticism from you Democrats. And I said, okay.
But it was the community support. It was the editorial pressure from the newspapers, the news pressure from the newspapers, the electronic media that put pressure on the state government to finally take action, and ultimately that pressure built, and it happened, and the rest is history. We have a university that's grown from the 412 that we started the first year to over 10,000 students.
And looking back, it was a monumental deal, but it wasn't all just legislators, because of the whole community, we said.
So people could see, I mean, all over the state, that people in southern Indiana and this community were willing to put their money where their mouth was when it came to supporting higher education.
Those were the key points, were the fact that SAHI was paid for by local citizens. We had the community support. We took the editors with us. We took community chamber of commerce people, and we had the support of the commission. So all the fact, it would be really hard to say no with all the information that we had and show the community support. And I think that was, pretty key.
But obviously, this university's done quite well in the last 40 years, so it's a real achievement to, I think, the foresight of those legislators who caused it to happen, along with the governor, because the proof is in the pudding as I drove in here today. You can really see that this is a very strong educational facility that serves people now not only in every county of the state, but I assume maybe almost every state in the country.
The passage in 1984 of a bill creating the Board of Incorporators for an independent university in southwestern Indiana paved the way for legislation to separate the Evansville campus from ISU. The legislation passed both houses of the 1985 legislature, and on April 16th, Governor Orr came to Evansville, where, surrounded by the southwestern Indiana legislative delegation, he signed the bill before a roaring audience of some 1,500 students, faculty, and community leaders. When Governor Orr convened the first Board of Trustees that June, he set a challenge for this new university to serve the entire state of Indiana and to not lose the spirit that had been the force of development of the university and its eventual status as a freestanding institution.
There's a certain spirit that prevails here, however, which had its origins back 20 years ago as the institution was beginning to form. It would be a real shame if, as Southern Indiana University becomes a state institution in the fullest sense of the word, that it lose this unique spirit that it has. One which has engendered a great deal of support at the local level, one where there is a huge amount of pride that this institution has grown and flourished, and all of that is something which needs to be retained at the same time that you broaden your horizons.
With their eyes on the future and hand in hand with legislators and community leaders, the new trustees set about an ambitious agenda, which 20 years later has changed the face of higher education in Indiana.